This is our second video on certainty and foreseeability. We're going to continue discussing the Hillard case, but we're going to talk about the second remedy requested as an alternative remedy because the court already determined lost profits are not certain and not foreseeable, therefore not recoverable. But what about the market value of the lost supply agreements that INN had with BBC? Are these recoverable? Did the appellate court award these to the plaintiff? And the answer is yes. The appellate court decided that lost assets were certain and foreseeable. And again, the lost assets are those supply agreements. But let's start with defining what lost assets are generally. The court stated that lost asset damages are considered hybrid damages, which are damages seeking to recover the market value for the loss of an income producing asset that was in its possession prior to breach. The big question is, well, are lost assets direct or consequential? Remember, direct damages are any performance promised under the contract that was not delivered. And consequential is any additional loss due to the breach, but not the actual performance under the contract. And so whatever contract, probably an employment contract that S had with INN or contracts it has with its shareholders as a derivative suit, we're not suing for that. We're suing for lost assets, which were these March 1994 and December 1994 agreements, which are separate contracts that they were lost due to the breach of whatever contract that H had with S, which it didn't describe in huge detail, or lost assets due to the fraud claim because they were unable to finance, but they said they were going to finance, or any lost assets as a result of breaching the fiduciary duty to the company. So the court decided here that lost asset damages are considered consequential because they're additional losses that result because of the breach of another contract or because of the breach of a fiduciary duty or fraud. But in order to recover lost asset damages, similar to lost profits, we have to determine, was it foreseeable and was it certain? And so let's start with the first issue, foreseeability, which is the easy issue. The court said, well, yes, these lost asset damages that were suffered by INN were foreseeable because it was within the contemplation of the parties. Hillard's own testimony acknowledged that the BBC would not have agreed to enter the interim and December supply agreements if the Hillards had not proposed to fund the interim agreement. And as a result of Hillard's not being able to get the proper funding, INN lost these assets, which was the agreement with BBC. So they had a whole conversation about it. BBC was hesitant. The Hillard says, no, we're going to fund it. So it's obviously foreseeable if the Hillards aren't able to fund it, that BBC is going to pull out of the agreement, which is exactly what happened. So foreseeability, very easy to establish. Certainty was much more complicated, but the court used the same two-step rule used to analyze lost profits. One, has the plaintiff established with reasonable certainty that the lost asset damages existed? And if yes, has the plaintiff established the amount of lost asset damages with reasonable certainty? Let's start with step number one. Specifically, the court clarified that lost asset damages can be tangible, such as physical personal property you have or real property, as well as intangible, like supply agreements or the right to BBC's programming. The court also discussed how lost profits are distinct from lost assets. Just because lost profits are not certain or not foreseeable doesn't mean it's going to prevent you from getting lost assets. They're two different distinct harms. The court said, although the supply contracts are a form of intangible property, it has an ascertainable value, which means, yes, these damages exist. But the big issue is, well, what is this value? How did the court determine the value of these lost assets? And this is where the court spent most of its time. The court said the market value of lost assets is measured by two things, either the income it would have produced or the value at the time of breach. And here the value at the time of breach was the best measure, because if we try to determine the income these supply agreements with BBC would have produced, we'll be right back in the lost profits uncertainty world, because we can't calculate it. INN is a new business. But we're able to measure the value of the supply agreements at the time of breach because we have an incomplete transaction here where the Hillards were going to sell the BBC rights to Cox. However, it didn't go through because the Hillards pulled out when Cox defaulted on a payment. And the court said when you have an incomplete transaction, you want to look at, well, what is the asset that we're dealing with? If the asset is actively traded on the standard exchange or market, then you can look at prior sales history, experts' opinions, sales of comparable assets, as well as the asset's owner's own testimony of the market value. You can look at all this evidence to determine, well, what is the value of this lost asset that's tangible or intangible at the time of breach? But if the asset is not traded, then we have to have this hypothetical market standard, which is what a buyer is willing to pay and what a seller is willing to sell, when, of course, both parties have knowledge of the relevant facts and do a fair arm's length negotiation. Here we have the June 1994 agreement with Cox, which the court said is considered prior sales history because Cox was going to buy the exclusive right to BBC's programming. And the court said that the lower court erred in excluding the expert testimony about these supply agreements. The court also said that the Cox agreement was equivalent to what a buyer would be willing to pay for these BBC rights, as well as what the seller, the Hillards, were willing to sell it for. And both had reasonable knowledge of the facts and both did an arm's length negotiation because Cox was a well-informed leader in the cable television industry, even though INN was a new company. Thus, in this particular situation, you had a little bit of assets actively traded on the market as well as assets not traded blending together in the court's analysis. But let's break down specifically how the court determined that the Cox agreement was enough to prove the amount of damages with reasonable certainty. The Cox agreement was used to measure the lost asset damages because remember, H agreed to sell these rights to Cox for $1.7 million plus 5% equity in Cox's proposed BBC channel. The court held a reasonable jury could find that INN's programming rights were worth at least $700K plus the present value of the $1 million paid over the 10 years, a total of $1.39 million, which is less than the original agreement between H and Cox for the BBC channels, because that agreement was for $1.7 million plus 5% equity. The court also held there was sufficient evidence to calculate the dollar value of the 5% equity. Again, using the Cox agreement to measure, well, 1.39 million is close to 1.7 million, and then now we can decide the 5% equity based on these numbers. The court also said the Cox agreement is okay to use as evidence because it's comparable to the supply agreements, the agreements for BBC's exclusive rights. It's not so unique to Cox that it's not admissible as evidence because Cox was just the party that the Hillards agreed to sell the rights to. They could have chosen any other cable company. It just so happens that Cox was the party on the other side. And both of them did an arm's length negotiation, and the deal would have gone through if the Hillards actually just gave Cox more time. But the Hillards decided against that and decided to cancel the contract. Now, why did the court allow all of this evidence to come in, and why was this enough to establish step 2, reasonable certainty? Well, remember that wrongdoer rule we talked about in the previous video. Right now, the burden is on the Hillards to prove that this amount is uncertain. And in this case, the Hillards did not meet that burden. The court determined, well, there's enough certainty here because there is the value of what the buyer is willing to pay, which is Cox, for a chance to make speculative profits at a certain point in time, which is the chance to make profits off of BBC's channels at this time when all this is going on. And so that was enough to say lost assets have been established with reasonable certainty, as well as the amount has been established with reasonable certainty. Now, the third issue or the third request for damages, punitive damages, there wasn't a whole lot, but the appellate court decided, yes, the claim was improperly limited to $15K, basically saying you can get punitive damages and it's not limited to anything. So this case was really complicated. In my opinion, I think this case overcomplicated the limitations on recovery. I really just want you to focus on these rules that I'm going to have on this slide for purposes of the exam, as well as for purposes of the bar, because it's a lot simpler than this Hillard case. For foreseeability, damages are not recoverable for loss that the party in breach did not have reason to foresee as a probable result of the breach when the contract was made. Essentially, it's the reasonable person standard at the time the contract was made. You use that objective standard, It does have to be probable, not merely possible. So it can't be so remote or so far removed. And it's the loss of harm that must be foreseeable. So you're looking at the harm or the loss, not the actual misconduct itself. Now, we didn't talk about causation at all in the Hillard case, but I want to make sure that you know causation is implied in any tort or any breach of contract because the defendant's actions must be the actual cause of the plaintiff's harm. So, the defendant's breach of contract had to actually cause harm, or the defendant's voluntary act had to actually cause harm. So, just remember that underlying requirement exists. And then, third, we have certainty. Damages are not recoverable for loss beyond an amount that the evidence permits to be established with reasonable certainty. It does not require absolute precision. However, you must have actual known reliable factors. It can't be based on assumptions, it can't be speculative, or it cannot be hypothetical. And remember, new businesses are looked at with higher scrutiny because there's a lot of hypotheticals. And remember the wrongdoer rule, where the burden to prove the amount of damages are uncertain is on the wrongdoer. So you give the benefit of the doubt to the plaintiff in that case, unless the wrongdoer can show that the plaintiff hasn't provided enough evidence. This is how it works in contracts. How does foreseeability and certainty work in torts? Causation, it works the same. Certainty, it works the same as well. The base rule of foreseeability in torts is essentially the same. A defendant is liable for harm that is a reasonably foreseeable result of the defendant's conduct. It must reasonably flow from the defendant's act. It's pretty much the same as contracts. It needs to be reasonably foreseeable. It can't be too far removed. We're using an objective standard. However, where it differs in torts from contracts is the harm itself must be foreseeable, right? Similar to contracts, but the extent of harm does not need to be foreseeable. So it does allow a little bit more space for remoteness here under the thin skull plaintiff rule, where you'll be reliable for any extent of harm, even if it's not foreseeable. Where in contracts, they're a little bit more limited, where the harm needs to be foreseeable at the time the contract was made.